Hey, what's up everybody? Alex here from My Matter Productions coming at you with another video. Today we'll be talking about MIDI drum programming 101 and covering all the fundamental concepts and anything you need to know to get started MIDI drum programming today. So let's get started. Before we dive in, I'd like to go over what we got going on here. So today we are in Ableton. I've got Superior Drummer loaded on one track, which will emulate more of a realistic drum sound. Like a typical kit. I've also got a drum rack loaded into another track, which will be more electronic sounds for those of you who might be doing more electronic music or just wanting to try something different. And I've got a guitar riff and a bass line loaded as well, because sometimes when you're programming drums, you can get a lot more groove and a lot more ideas coming up when you're actually programming to something, right? Because sometimes just coming up with a drum beat can be a little stale. Let's go ahead and open up Superior Drummer here. So the first step before you start programming MIDI drums is obviously finding your sounds. So in here I've loaded a kit already, which is kind of a hard rock kit, and it's got a lot of toms, a lot of cymbals, a lot of options. You might not need this many options if you're going for something a little bit more simple, but I'll give you a little sample of what they sound like. Right, so you have your snare sound, your tom sounds here, your hi-hat, kick drum, cymbals, crash cymbals, ride, another crash, and a China cymbal. Depending what you're going for, you might want to include extra percussion elements, or you might want to find a different kind of snare drum, like maybe something that's a little more bodied or more high-end, and a different kick drum to suit the kind of music you're going for. Now that we have all the sounds of our kit selected, let's go ahead and jump into the MIDI grid editor, which is where all the magic happens for programming MIDI drums. Today I'm using Superior Drummer 3's internal MIDI grid editor, which is fantastic, but any MIDI grid editor in a DAW will work fine. The key for drums is, since it doesn't have any musical note values per se, it is the dynamics which will transmit the most amount of realism in your parts. So having multiple articulations of different components of your drum kit are crucial. Before diving deep into the different articulation and the different velocity values to enhance the dynamics of a drum part, I'd like to just go over some of the fundamental rhythmic concepts of programming drums. And once we're familiar with that, then we can move on to the next part. So what I've got here is a standard kind of rock beat, so I'll just play it for you. I'm sure we've all heard this before. Right? So what's going on here? Well, first of all, at this number 5 to number 6 is what we call a bar, or a measure of music, which is divided into beats, right? So from 5 to 6 would be 1 bar, 6 to 7 is 1 bar, and this whole thing from 5 to 9 would be a 4-bar piece of music. Within a normal 4/4 time signature, 1 bar from 5 to 6 will have 4 beats. So this kick drum has 1 kick drum per beat. This hi-hat has 2 hi-hats per beat, and the snare lands on the first and the third beat of this bar of music. These different spaces between the notes within a bar of music is what we would call a note value. So this kick drum would be called a quarter note because there's 4 notes per bar of music. This hi-hat would be 8 notes because there's 8 hi-hats per bar of music. If we would go in here and zoom in and pencil in more notes between these 8th notes on the hi-hat, then we would have 16th notes. And all of these different spaces between the notes is what will give the listener the different interpretation of time. So if I play this little section that has now 16th notes on the hi-hat, you'll notice that it has a lot more of a driving energy than the 8 notes. Compared to the 8 notes that follow it right afterwards. I could go ahead and change these to quarter notes, and that will change the feel to an even slower time. So just every quarter note, this is what it sounds like. So it's half the time of the eighth notes. I can also do this with the snare. I could take out every second snare of this pattern, and you'll see the variation it gives. So I would say that the kick, snare, and hi-hat placement and articulation will be the most driving components in a drum beat. So I've gone ahead and returned us back to our original drum beat and unmuted the guitar riff that I have in my program, and I'll show you how changing the kick and snare placement can drastically change how you interpret whatever other musical content is going on inside a song. So we'll start it off with just a simple beat and the guitar riff so you can listen to it, and we'll change it up and we'll see how easily it is to change the perception of that one riff. So I'm just going to mess with the kick and snare. I'm going to take out every second snare and maybe keep the last one here, and take out every second kick. And we'll see how that sounds. So notice the snare, having half the amount of snare really makes the groove kind of drag a little bit. And the kick placement is just a little bit less driving. Let's go ahead and maybe accent some kick notes here. On the beginning of every bar, we'll add 2 kicks. And then on the last bar, we'll keep the last kick here. We'll put back our snares, but on every second bar, we'll add a second snare. Another thing we could do is change the articulation of our hi-hats to maybe a more open feel. Maybe something like that. And we could also accent some of these snare hits. A useful tool to accent parts of a riff or a song is to use crash cymbals. So we'll go in here and grab, let's say, this cymbal here and this cymbal here to accent these snare hits. So let's see how that sounds. Another thing we could do is take these hi-hats and change them to maybe a ride cymbal and see how that sounds. We could also move these to a crash cymbal and maybe diminish the note value. So go to quarter notes instead of eighth notes, which will really change the timing of how we hear the song. I'll leave this second half at 8 so we can really hear the difference. So I've got a different drum beat loaded up here, playing over the same guitar riff that we were listening to previously, but this drum beat is more of a shuffle. So you can hear that with this kind of beat, it accentuates the riff completely differently. Here's the listen. This drum beat's a lot more detail, as you can see, as the hi-hat has many different velocity values, as you can see here, which is velocity is how hard a hit is, 127 being the maximum MIDI value of the hardest hit you could emulate digitally, and 0 being the lowest. spending the extra time on adjusting the velocity values of your hi-hat, your snare, your kick, adding ghost notes, all these little details will really enhance the sound of your drums. It will make it sound realistic, because a lot of the time people don't go that extra step and it sounds just really boring. You can tell there's no movement to the beat. If, for example, I take all these hi-hats and just crank them max velocity, like the hardest hit possible, or maybe not the hardest hit, but even all the same hit possible. If I can just lower all these at the same time. There we go. Just flatline them. Same with the kick. We'll just maximum. And these ghost notes, non-existent. Listen to how different it sounds. Compared to this. So once again, we're back to the standard kind of rock 4 on the floor drum beat, but this time I have a bass groove going on underneath, and I want to show you in real time how we can adjust a drum beat to kind of accent grooves or accent parts of what an instrument is doing, more so to kind of bring it more to life. So we'll give a listen. So what we can do first and foremost is adjust the velocity of these flatline hi-hats, which are right now maxed to the most they could be. When we're programming drums to emulate a real drummer, there's a few things to keep in mind. First of all, that a drummer only has 4 limbs, so we can't actually hit 5 things at the same time. And also the ergonomics of how something is played on a kit, so that it's realistic and not just something so odd that's impossible to accomplish. And also that a drummer will feel out a song and kind of move with the song. So for example, if we would go into a hi-hat, right now all the velocity values of these hi-hats are maxed out, which means they would be hit as hard as possible every time, which is unrealistic. So we'll bring these down, and a drummer typically with this kind of beat will accentuate the downbeat of every bar. So if we go in here and pull up the velocity of just the downbeats, which would be the 1 count, 2 count, 3 count of a bar. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And since we have 8 notes here, it would be 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So we'll leave the ands at a lower velocity value and the downbeats, so the counts, higher velocity values. And I'll leave the second half completely to the top just so we can hear the difference. So just with that, that makes a big difference in having some variation in your hi-hats compared to just a robotic pulse that's the same velocity value the whole time. Another thing we can do to emphasize what the bass is doing is to look at the kick drum and to try and emphasize when the bass is actually playing the note. So we'll paint in some notes here and we'll listen to what the bass is doing. So da da. So that already changes the feel quite a bit. And if we would say add a snare right there, it'll change the accent of how the pulse moves. So now I'd like to show you how I go about programming electronic drums, or drums for an electronic composition, or even if you're just experimenting around, because programming drums one hit at a time in a MIDI grid editor can be very tedious and can be very uncreative. So I like to go about programming drums kind of with a MIDI controller and just looping a part and kind of feeling it out and see what happens. So I'm going to create a MIDI clip here. I'm going to loop the part, hop over to session view here, and we'll just see what happens. I'm going to go to my controller and I'm going to start with the hi-hats and then maybe feel out the kick and snare afterwards, see where that goes. And maybe quantize this a little bit to 80%, 85% or so, just to keep some human feel in there. All right, that's sounding all right. Now I'm just gonna mess around with the kick and snare. So there was a quick example of how you can go about coming up with parts or vibing out a beat without the tedious process of programming each individual note in a MIDI editor and then editing your performance afterwards to tailor better, or if you're not the best drummer in the world, to get it better on time. That wraps it up for today's video. Stay tuned for more tips, tricks, and techniques on all things music. If you liked what you saw today, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and be sure to grab your free MIDI drum programming cheat sheet below. And until next time, I bid you farewell.